when they say anti-racism, when they say equity, we need to understand what that really is. They're not really anti-racist. They're not really pursuing real equality. Anti-racism is another word for critical race theory. It absolutely is. And in fact, anti-racism really means anti-Canada. That may seem strong for many people, but that's what it really is. Anti-racism basically teaches, as critical race theory does, is that our fundamental systems, including our education system, is fundamentally racist.
Natasha Biazzi for Rebel News. Today I'm joined by Samuel Say, a Canadian-Ghanaian blogger currently residing in the U.S. with his fiancée. He's extremely committed to addressing racial, cultural, and political issues from a biblical perspective. And today he's joining me via Skype to discuss critical race theory following the passing of the second reading of Bill 67, the Racial Equity in the Education System Act.
Critical race theory is very much already very entrenched in our curriculum here in Ontario. This bill would make it much more fundamental. It would actually be part of our education system, not just the school boards teaching it. It would be a fundamental part of our system here in Ontario. The other reason is that a lot of these politicians, these so-called conservative politicians, our own government, right, the so-called Conservative Party also ended up introducing this bill as well. And this just goes to show that, again, we don't have, a lot of politicians who are concerned about critical race theory. In fact, many of them are supporting it. And many of them are also very ignorant of what critical race theory is. I'm forgetting his name. I think it was Rick. I'm forgetting his last name.
Rick Nichols? Rick Nichols?
Yeah, Rick Nichols, yeah. Yeah, he's admitted recently that he didn't know what he was voting for when he voted for the bill. This just goes to show that a lot of our politicians need really us. They need the media. They need Rebel News. They need others to be informing them on what is really going on with what critical race theory really is and what is really being said in the bill.
Yeah, absolutely, because on the surface, critical race theory does sound like this positive and fruitful thing, and it's masking something that is quite sinister. So with that, do you have any advice for parents who might be trying to navigate this critical race theory push in schools?
Yeah. Well, one is when they say anti-racism, when they say equity, we need to understand what that really is. They're not really anti-racist. They're not really pursuing real equality. Anti-racism is another word for critical race theory. It absolutely is. And in fact, anti-racism really means anti-Canada. That may seem strong for many people, but that's what it really is. Anti-racism basically teaches, as critical race theory does, is that our fundamental systems, including our education system, is fundamentally racist. They believe that we need to change our values, we need to change our legal system, change our culture, change everything in order to make it a more anti-racist culture or systems, which basically means equity, right, or equality of outcome. And there's a book by one of the most popular critical race theories today, or so-called anti-racist today. His name is Ibram Kendi. And in his book, which is called How to Be Anti-Racist, which I think the better title is How to Be a Racist, he says that the remedy for past discrimination is future discrimination. He says that racial discrimination is only wrong if it leads to inequity, right? But it's good if it leads to racial equity. Now, these are his exact terms. This is what he says. This is not me paraphrasing. This is his literal words. And what he's saying there is, to be an anti-racist, you need to be racist against white people, right? So that's what it's really about. Now, in terms of how do you respond to that? Well, oftentimes schools will not come to parents and say, yeah, we are teaching your kids critical race theory. You need to be asking them these questions. And I know many parents who've asked these questions, and because they've asked the questions, the schools have backtracked because they're worried about what parents will react when they know that they're indoctrinating their kids with hate and discrimination through critical race theory. And also just informing our politicians, calling our politicians to be aware of this stuff, because frankly, most parents are more aware of what's going on in schools and with critical race theory than the politicians are.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot more pushback, it seems, from parents on both the left and the right in the United States. So now that you're living in the United States now, you recently moved, I think, a few months ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so now, like from what you've seen and heard so far, do you think that Canadians are more accepting of critical race theory? And if so, why?
Yeah, for what it's worth, I am, I'm getting married next month, so I'll be living in the U.S. I'm back in Canada for a while before I head back there in a couple of weeks. But yeah, it shocks a lot of Canadians when I say this. It's at the very least, critical race theory is just as common in Canada as it is in the U.S. But I would say it's even more popular here, because in the U.S. you have pushback from, as you said, people on the left and on the right, of course. But yet, and you saw that in Virginia, right, where a lot of liberals were voting for the Republicans because the Republicans naturally were against critical race theory. Sadly, here we don't have that kind of pushback here at all. As we mentioned, even the so-called Conservative Party ended up pushing critical race theory in education, right? So it's very different here, and that's because we're not as informed as Americans are on this issue. A lot of Canadians think that we don't have critical race theory being taught here, but it's absolutely happening here. Just to give an example, last year I'm a Christian, and I was invited to a Christian university to speak on critical race theory. Well, sorry, on racism. But they assumed because I was black, this school in Calgary, it's Ambrose University, because I was black that I was going to talk about critical race theory, or at least support critical race theory. Well, that's not what I did. I explained that critical race theory is wrong, it is un-Christian, and it's un-Canadian. And well, a few weeks later, the school shared a public statement denouncing me for apparently denigrating the students and attacking the students and denying racism, all these things. Now, again, this is an all-white Canadian school, and yet they were all-white Christian school in Canada, and yet they were denouncing me, a black man, for speaking in a biblical manner about what critical race theory is. So just imagine this. If we imagine that Christian universities would be amongst the bastion of conservatism, or being truly against critical race theory in our country, and yet it's not. So if it's in the Christian universities, if it's in churches, it's absolutely everywhere in our culture. It's in our media. It's in our education, for sure. It's in our jobs. I mean, how many of us are aware? Even my own mother was forced into taking diversity and inclusion courses, which is all critical race theory, and so it's everywhere in our country. I mean, there's a poll from last year where Canadians were asked if they believe Canada is a systemically racist nation. I think about 55% of the respondents said yes. Well, the same poll was done in the U.S. A few months earlier, and the results were the same. It was around 55% too. So Canadians, because of critical race theory, believe that Canada is just as racist as America is, even though we have completely different histories. Yet Canadians feel the same way about our country as many Americans do about their country, and that's because of critical race theory.
Yeah, it's crazy just how powerful this narrative has become in our country. But it's so important, as you said earlier, to just keep talking about this. So I appreciate your voice. Can you let our viewers know where they can find you and support you, and just hear what you have to say? Because you are kind of a big figure on this topic in this country.
Thank you so much. Yeah, they can find me on my blog, slowtowrite.com. Just as it's pronounced, slow to write. And then also they can find me across all social media platforms at the same name, Slow to Write, as well. And I've really been blessed by having you here, by you having me here. So thank you very much.
Oh, anytime. Thank you so much, Samuel. Bill 67, the Racial Equity in the Education System Act, recently passed its second reading in Ontario's legislature. This bill will inject critical race theory into every sector of Ontario's education system. If you agree we need to stop the implementation of critical race theory in Ontario schools, please sign our petition at stopcrt.ca. There you can also fill out a form to send an email to Ontario MPPs calling on them to stop this bill.